While most Americans were preoccupied with holiday plans, retail sales, and the usual stream of political chatter, something far more consequential unfolded beneath the surface. A significant shift in U.S. immigration and foreign policy was set into motion by President Trump, a shift so extensive that many analysts now describe it as one of the most dramatic reorientations in decades. Yet because it happened quietly, with very little pre-announcement, it escaped the attention of most households. Behind the scenes, Trump delivered a message to Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro that blindsided lawmakers, temporarily suspended asylum cases nationwide without establishing a time horizon, and signaled a broad restructuring of migration dynamics. According to the administration, these decisions are not abstract policy adjustments, but immediate corrective measures intended to redefine security, stabilize communities, and reshape regional influence. What makes this moment especially pivotal is that these actions were not isolated responses, but interconnected moves triggered by intelligence, briefings, rising fraud investigations, and a rapidly evolving international environment. Today, we'll unpack exactly what Trump communicated, why these developments carry deeper significance than most realize, and how they may reshape the daily life of Americans in the months ahead. The first domino began to tip when Trump phoned Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, a figure whose tenure has long generated controversy due to allegations of corruption, human rights violations, and mismanagement. Unlike routine diplomatic exchanges, this call wasn't designed for courtesy, negotiation, or gradual easing of tensions. It was delivered as a blunt and uncompromising ultimatum. From the Oval Office directly to Caracas, Trump issued a clear directive: Maduro needed to relinquish power immediately. He was offered a guarantee of safe departure for himself and his family, but only if he stepped down without resistance. The message wasn't phrased as a polite suggestion. It was a definitive warning that his time at the helm was over. The implications were enormous. Rarely does a sitting U.S. president so directly instruct another head of state to vacate office. This wasn't diplomacy as usual, it was strategic pressure built on years of tension, regional destabilization, and the collapse of Venezuela's economy. Surprisingly, Maduro didn't respond with immediate rejection. Instead, according to individuals familiar with the exchange, he made two requests aimed at preserving dignity and maintaining a degree of influence even after departure. Maduro's counter-request revealed not only hesitation, but an effort to maintain leverage. First, he asked for additional time, an attempt to craft an exit that wouldn't appear as though Washington forced him from power. This delay, he hoped, would help save face domestically and buy room to negotiate protections. Second, in a more striking proposal, he expressed willingness to relinquish the presidency itself, but sought to retain oversight of Venezuela's armed forces. That demand was immediately rejected. From the U.S. perspective, leaving Maduro in charge of the military would simply extend the regime's power under a different label. Trump's team viewed such an arrangement as cosmetic rather than substantive, a rearranging of titles rather than a genuine transfer of authority. For the administration, the objective was full political restructuring, the type necessary for lasting stability and for reintegration with global markets. Any plan permitting Maduro to hold on to military authority was a non-starter. The message was firm: a transition meant actual change, not symbolic concessions. The U.S. wanted a leadership shift, capable of restoring institutions, reinvigorating the economy, and preventing foreign adversaries from expanding influence in the region. Then came the unexpected twist. Another phone call between Trump and Maduro had been scheduled to continue discussions, clarify timelines, and potentially finalize an agreement. Yet when the appointed time arrived, Maduro simply didn't appear on the line. He didn't request rescheduling, he didn't offer explanation. Communication ceased entirely. This sudden silence sent immediate shockwaves through Washington. Analysts speculated that Maduro was recalibrating his response, possibly seeking counsel from allies like China, Russia, or Cuba. Others believed he was testing Trump's resolve, gauging whether the U.S. intended to escalate pressure if he stalled. The lack of communication created an environment of uncertainty, a dangerous condition in international affairs, where misinterpretations can quickly intensify conflicts. Within the U.S. government, the abrupt disengagement triggered strategic reassessment. Would negotiations continue? Would sanctions tighten? Would the U.S. signal strength with a public message? That uncertainty culminated in Trump's decision to schedule a formal national address centered specifically on Venezuela. The gravity of the announcement, delivered from the Oval Office rather than social media or a casual press call, signaled that the situation had entered a new phase. The question shared by journalists, diplomats, and foreign leaders alike was, Why Venezuela and why now? To understand the urgency, one must consider the country's geopolitical weight. Venezuela possesses the largest known reserves of crude oil on Earth, surpassing even Saudi Arabia. Despite the nation's immense natural wealth, decades of corruption, economic mismanagement, and authoritarian governance have devastated the population. Hyperinflation shattered purchasing power, forcing citizens to carry bundles of cash just to afford bread. Basic services collapsed. Millions fled to neighboring countries and to the United States, creating one of the largest mass migration crises in the Western Hemisphere. For the U.S., assisting in the establishment of a stable post-Maduro government could unlock extraordinary economic and diplomatic opportunities. American energy companies could participate in redevelopment, regional stability could improve, and most importantly, Venezuelan families scattered worldwide, including hundreds of thousands in the U.S., might finally have the option to return home. Trump labeled this potential movement reverse migration, arguing that restoring nations abroad could naturally reduce migration pressure on the United States. That idea laid the foundation for the sweeping domestic decisions that followed. Trump made clear that his Venezuela initiative was not an isolated foreign policy maneuver, but part of a broader strategy to realign immigration flows and national security priorities. The most controversial aspect of this strategy was his claim that the U.S. must initiate reverse migration, the idea that the direction of population movement must begin shifting outward rather than inward. Under this approach, immigrants who entered during periods of heightened border leniency or crisis-driven surges could be encouraged or required to return to their countries of origin, particularly if those nations stabilize politically and economically. For Trump, solving migration challenges isn't limited to controlling borders. It requires fixing the root causes abroad that compelled millions to leave in the first place. If nations like Venezuela rebuild, he argues, people will choose to go home voluntarily, reducing strain on American infrastructure, welfare programs, and law enforcement. Critics argue such a large-scale reversal is unrealistic, but supporters maintain that previous administrations allowed unsustainable inflows without ensuring the U.S. could effectively integrate new arrivals. Trump's framing positioned reverse migration as both a practical necessity and a corrective measure after years of policy failures. But the most immediate and tangible shift occurred when Trump announced a nationwide suspension of asylum proceedings. This wasn't a temporary slowdown, administrative delay, or partial adjustment. All in-person asylum interviews and case processing were halted without specifying a resumption date. USCIS issued directives to offices across the country, instructing them to freeze ongoing decisions and postpone all upcoming appointments. When reporters pressed the administration for clarity on duration, Trump stated plainly that the pause could last a very long time, giving no indication of short-term reconsideration. This declaration represented one of the most significant immigration policy changes in recent years. According to the administration, the asylum system had become overloaded, vulnerable to exploitation, and compromised by inadequate vetting. Communities across America expressed concerns about rapid demographic changes, local resource strain, and inconsistent enforcement. Trump's argument was that the United States had reached a aching point, that the volume of incoming asylum seekers exceeded its ability to vet, integrate, and support them responsibly. The indefinite pause was presented as a safety measure, not a political maneuver. Though reactions to it immediately polarized the nation, the controversy intensified when Trump cited the reasons behind the pause, referencing two separate incidents that deeply alarmed national security officials. The first involved two National Guard members who were shot in Washington, D.C. by an Afghan refugee who had arrived under Operation Allies Welcome. The initiative launched after the chaotic U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. That program aimed to relocate individuals who had assisted American forces, but execution was hurried and vetting inconsistent. The second incident unfolded in Texas, where another Afghan migrant admitted under the same initiative was arrested after posting videos in which he assembled what appeared to be an explosive device. Authorities alleged he expressed intent to target a location in the Fort Worth area. Though the majority of Afghan evacuees have lived peacefully, the involvement of even a small number in violent or potentially terrorist acts intensified scrutiny of the program's oversight. Trump argued these cases demonstrated systemic vulnerabilities, reinforcing his claim that previous administrations prioritized public messaging and humanitarian optics over rigorous screening, an approach he claimed placed American lives at risk. In fairness, national security experts emphasize that the vast majority of people brought into the country through such programs do not pose threats and live productive, peaceful lives. Nonetheless, From a counterterrorism perspective, even one overlooked bad actor can create catastrophic outcomes. Trump supporters saw the incidents as evidence that vetting processes were insufficient and that threats associated with poorly screened individuals could be far greater than the government acknowledged. The incidents transformed the immigration debate from a conversation about statistics into a discussion about safety and responsibility. For many Americans, hearing that violent crimes were committed by people brought in through a program designed for trusted allies raised serious questions about accuracy of intelligence, proper documentation, and interagency coordination. These doubts brought renewed attention to underlying system weaknesses, pushing the immigration conversation beyond humanitarian narratives and into the realm of national security imperatives. The administration used these cases as justification to re-examine policies that fast-tracked admissions, arguing that empathy cannot override essential safeguards. The deeper investigators dug, the more they found structural problems extending beyond individual cases. One of the most surprising revelations was that federal agencies, including the FBI, were categorizing individuals from Middle Eastern and North African nations such as Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, and Morocco under the racial category white due to an outdated classification system originating in the 1940s. That antiquated system had never been thoroughly modernized, leading to decades of statistical inaccuracies in crime reports, threat assessments, and demographic analyses. In other words, incidents involving individuals from certain regions were recorded under incorrect racial groups, skewing data used by policymakers and media outlets to discuss national security risks. Trump and his allies pointed to this as evidence that official records were not only inaccurate, but potentially misleading. If entire communities were mislabeled in federal data, the public narrative regarding which groups commit certain crimes or pose specific threats could not be trusted. Critics accused Trump of exploiting technical issues for political gain, but others argued that ignoring flawed data prevents effective policymaking and undermines public trust. While national security concerns unfolded on the federal stage, Minnesota became the center of a separate crisis that stunned much of the country. Over several years, investigators uncovered a massive fraud operation involving networks of shell companies, fabricated medical claims, and ghost billing schemes. The perpetrators, operating primarily within segments of the Somali community, manipulated state and federal programs intended to support vulnerable children and families. They submitted fraudulent claims for autism therapy, mental health services, nutrition programs, and housing assistance. In many cases, services billed to the government had never been provided, clients didn't exist, or facilities were little more than rented mailboxes. Funds flowed from taxpayers to fraudulent entities, and then, according to prosecutors, were transferred overseas, including to regions with ties to extremist groups such as Al-Shabaab. The financial scale of the fraud reached into the billions, exceeding the budgets of major state agencies. Even investigators accustomed to large-scale white-collar crimes expressed shock at the breadth, coordination, and persistence of the operation. Despite this, mainstream media outlets ignored the story for months, prompting accusations of selective reporting and political discomfort. Eventually, the evidence became too substantial to dismiss. Federal indictments were unsealed, suspects were arrested, and the scope of the operation was revealed to the public. Even traditionally left-leaning publications that had avoided the topic were forced to cover it. The New York Times published an article examining how Minnesota's social service system allowed widespread exploitation, raising questions about oversight under Governor Tim Walz. When journalists confronted Walz, asking whether he accepted responsibility for the systemic failures that allowed billions in taxpayer money to be siphoned away, his response stirred further controversy. Instead of acknowledging mismanagement, he redirected the conversation, warning against demonizing an entire community and dismissing the inquiry as rooted in prejudice. Many critics viewed this as deflection, arguing that acknowledging fraud doesn't equate to targeting innocent individuals. The dispute highlighted a larger trend. Concerns about immigration-related crime or systemic abuse are often shut down by accusations of racism, making open discussion nearly impossible. For many Americans, Walz's response symbolized a broader unwillingness among certain political leaders to address uncomfortable truths, even when supported by federal investigations and documented financial losses. The fraud cases themselves were staggering in detail. One example involved a man who had more than $200,000 billed under his name for autism treatment in less than a year, despite the fact that he had never received those services and was actually living abroad at the time. When he contacted the fraudulent provider, they offered explanations involving clerical errors, but the money had already been dispersed. This was not a lone incident. Investigators uncovered hundreds of similar cases involving non-existent patients, forged diagnostic records, and falsified signatures. Pandemic-era nutrition programs designed to feed children were exploited through fictitious meal counts. Clinic operators purchased luxury vehicles, real estate, and international airline tickets using taxpayer money intended for vulnerable families. Federal officials traced significant funds to overseas accounts, and some transfers were linked to individuals with ties to extremist organizations. The revelations turned what might have been interpreted as a welfare scandal into a potential national security threat. The concern was no longer simply financial waste, but the possibility that U.S. taxpayer dollars were indirectly funding terrorism. This connection intensified demands for accountability and fueled broader debates about immigration policy. Amid all these revelations, Trump shifted to a topic that surprised many: denaturalization. Historically, stripping someone of U.S. citizenship has been extremely rare, reserved for cases involving fraud in the naturalization process or for individuals who engaged in espionage or fought against U.S. forces. Trump suggested expanding the criteria, arguing that citizenship should not protect individuals who actively work against American interests, promote extremist ideology, or publicly reject the foundational principles of the country. He cited examples of public officials and activists who criticize American institutions while benefiting from the rights and privileges granted by citizenship. One particularly contentious reference involved remarks about a member of Congress who has been surrounded by controversy involving alleged immigration fraud and inflammatory statements about U.S. policies. Though Trump didn't mention her by name, Y believed he was referencing Rep. Ilhan Omar. The debate this sparked revolved around the nature of citizenship itself. Is it purely a legal status, or does it carry expectations related to loyalty, civic responsibility, and assimilation? Critics accused Trump of authoritarian impulses, while supporters argued that citizenship should not be a shield for those who undermine national unity. This discussion segued into Trump's broader point about national identity. He argued that America is reaching a critical juncture at which its cultural cohesion is threatened by fragmented communities, inconsistent assimilation, and political leaders reluctant to enforce shared norms. According to Trump, the United States has prioritized inclusivity to the point of abandoning expectations of integration. He contends that immigrants are no longer encouraged to learn English, embrace American customs, or develop a sense of loyalty to the country. Instead, separate cultural enclaves have grown, creating parallel societies rather than a unified national identity. He pointed out that America's foreign-born population has grown to over 50 million, the highest figure in U.S. history. Immigration itself isn't the issue, he argued. It's the erosion of the long-standing social contract in which newcomers adopt American values in exchange for opportunity. Instead, Trump claims, the system now incentivizes dependency, division, and cultural fragmentation. Supporters believe these are necessary truths that politicians have avoided discussing, while opponents accuse Trump of fostering nativism and fear. Regardless of perspective, the concern about declining national cohesion continues to resonate across a large portion of the electorate. Trump supplemented his argument with statistics indicating that a significant percentage of immigrant households rely on government assistance. To him, this challenges the narrative that immigration universally strengthens the economy and reduces dependency. The traditional model of immigration, where individuals arrive with a determination to build new lives through work, assimilation, and shared cultural values, has, in his view, become less common due to policy decisions that prioritize volume over quality. He argued that prioritizing mass inflows without adequate screening, integration programs, or enforcement mechanisms strains social services and undercuts public confidence in the system. Supporters applaud this frank assessment, asserting that millions of Americans feel overwhelmed by rapid demographic changes and rising socioeconomic pressures. Critics counter that Trump's framing oversimplifies complex issues and unfairly groups diverse immigrant populations together. Nevertheless, the tension reflects a broader national debate. What kind of immigration system does America need to remain cohesive, prosperous, and secure? Trump positions his arguments as a call to restore balance, establish clear expectations for new arrivals, and protect the nation from exploitation, both criminal and systemic. He also emphasized the importance of cultural integration, arguing that America cannot function as a unified society if large segments of the population do not share common language, values, or civic understanding. According to Trump, every previous era of successful immigration was built on assimilation, not on government programs or political narratives, but on a universal belief in becoming American. Today, he claims, that expectation has eroded. Leaders fear accusations of discrimination, institutions avoid enforcing standards, and entire communities are encouraged to maintain separate identities. Trump asserts that the U.S. must return to an immigration model that emphasizes cultural cohesion, rule of law, and national loyalty. Supporters argue that these expectations foster unity and preserve the country's foundational character. Opponents warn that strict assimilation requirements may suppress cultural diversity and violate individual freedoms. Yet the underlying debate raises important questions. What obligations do immigrants have toward their new nation? What responsibilities does America have toward newcomers? And can a country remain stable if its citizens lack shared understanding of fundamental principles? These are issues that will shape U.S. policy for decades. Taken together, Trump's decisions, from confronting Maduro to freezing asylum cases and raising questions about national identity, represent a sweeping attempt to redefine America's approach to immigration, security, and foreign policy. Whether one agrees with his strategy or not, its magnitude is undeniable. He is challenging decades of bipartisan norms, questioning long-standing assumptions, and proposing dramatic shifts in how the United States interacts with both immigrants and foreign governments. Supporters view this as necessary correction after years of policy failures and political hesitation. Critics see it as destabilizing and extreme. But what cannot be overlooked is the scale of the moment. This is a turning point that will influence elections, international relations, and domestic debates throughout the nation. As global conditions continue to evolve, and as Americans wrestle with questions of identity, security, and community, the choices made now will echo long into the future. What comes next will depend on public response, congressional action, and international reaction. But one thing is certain: the political landscape has shifted dramatically, and America is entering a new chapter unlike any in recent history.